Before we get to the Women in Public Service book, I want to review a few things. Some people have more familiarity than others with some of these concepts, so that's why I want to do a quick review. So, we're going to talk about feminism and equality more generally. So, historically, there have been two different approaches to equality, and we often refer to this as the equality versus the difference debate. So, how can demands for gender equality be reconciled with sex differences? Does equal necessarily mean the same? So, can men and women be the same if they are different? So, the two approaches to equality have been called the legal equality doctrine and the fairness doctrine. Now, the legal equality doctrine basically advocates erasing the differences between men and women. So, you treat women and men the same or equally under the law. Whereas the fairness doctrine, on the other hand, recognizes the differences between women and men and argues that women will always be disadvantaged if they are not compensated for social, economic, and political consequences of the differences that they have compared to men. So it's arguing for women should be treated fairly, and fairness means that you should treat women differently than men rather than the same as men. Now, feminism hasn't been an effective organizing philosophy for women's movements because of this equality paradox. This is part of the reason, anyway. Now, I want to also back up and define what patriarchy is. Now, patriarchy literally means rule of the fathers, and it refers to the pervasive control that men have over social, economic, and political power and resources. This is not specific to the United States, but worldwide. Now, what we call the separate spheres ideology is what strengthens patriarchy. This is the belief that women are best suited to the private sphere of the home and family due to biological differences, and that men are best suited to the public sphere of work and politics. Now, in the United States, we borrowed this concept of coverture from England, and this was in place until the mid 1800s. And coverture defined married couples as one entity. And you guessed it, that entity under the law was the husband. Now, women couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, and they couldn't work for wages. Now, patriarchy is often criticized by women, but I think oftentimes what is overlooked is that patriarchy also makes nasty assumptions about men. And because it relies on this whole separate spheres ideology, it basically constrains men and women into certain boxes and then punishes them when they get outside of those boxes. So one of the nasty assumptions that patriarchy makes about men is that they can't control themselves. You know, that they're going to rape women because that is in their DNA, it's in their biology. They can't control themselves. So patriarchy is also very damaging to men, but we often don't talk about that side of how patriarchy is damaging to men as well as to women. Now, politics is complicated. So trying to define politics is actually a political act in and of itself. And according to some of our definitions in political science, women's political participation didn't exist prior to 1920 if we're only examining electoral party or institutional behavior. But women were actually very active politically in terms of non traditional political behavior that has been studied more recently and is part of our definitions today, but not necessarily historically of political activity. So, for example, the Daughters of Liberty, the participation of women in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and of course, women were involved in numerous voluntary associations and social movements. They were involved in abolition and temperance. They were involved in the progressive movement. So they were very involved in political movements, but yet their political participation has often not been acknowledged historically. Now, it's also important to define sex and gender. So, sex refers to someone's biology. So, what are their reproductive parts, basically? Whereas gender refers to the social construction of that sex. So, how do we interpret that sex based characteristic? So, what is the socially constructed value? So, my kind of running joke is just because I have a uterus, that does not help me in any way at all to be a good cook. My husband, who does not have a uterus, is a much better cook than I am because guess what? Again, there's nothing about a uterus that makes me inherently a good cook. But that is, again, one of the gender stereotypes that we have, and that is how we socially construct what that sex means. So, what does having a uterus means? Well, historically, having a uterus means that I should be a good cook because I'm a woman. So that's what we mean by social construction of that sex. So it's not just the sex, it's how we interpret what that sex means for what people should do in their day to day lives, what they should be good at. And of course, that translates to work life as well. Now, some of the underlying assumptions of the legal equality doctrine, so I'm going to kind of switch back. Sorry about that. But we're going to go back to some of the underlying assumptions of the legal equality doctrine and the fairness doctrine. So first, under the legal equality doctrine, some of this idea rests on this notion that men and women are different both psychologically and sexually. And the roots under the legal equality doctrine for equality fall back on liberalism or individualism. So I don't mean like liberal conservative as we would talk about them today in political ideology terms, but we live in a liberal democracy, which means it is predicated on this notion of individual rights and individualism. So this refers to rational thought, individual choice, and your status in society is determined by individual action. It's not determined by what your station is in life or what you were born as in terms of like nobility and class, because again, the framers of the Constitution borrowed many of their ideas from other philosophers. So Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, for example. Now, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau actually believed that biological differences precluded women's participation in the social contract altogether, which is another interesting turn. But they didn't even acknowledge that women could be part of this social contract that they were defining. Now, some of the critiques of the legal equality doctrine are that women are still basically working within a patriarchal system, and you're never going to have equality if you're still working in that patriarchal system. Another critique is, can you really have gender neutral laws? And the neutral standard automatically becomes male. So that's the critique. Equality by whose standard and what standard are you measuring? So the male standard becomes the norm. And the male standard can create more of a burden for women because it ignores the differences that women may have in terms of their responsibilities. Now, the fairness doctrine, on the other hand, we see women's roles in the private sphere have precluded full participation in society. And separate spheres could be more empowering for middle and upper class white women specifically. And with the fairness doctrine, if you rely on this notion of difference, that you treat men and women differently, that opens up the door for lots of essentialism and laws that are based on the notion that men and women are different. So therefore, they can be paid differently, even though they're doing the same job. And that's what's happened historically. So there's lots of criticism of the fairness doctrine as well. And lastly, I would say that another critique is that it's essentialist. So when I talk about essentialism, I'm referring to the notion that there is something essential about being a man or a woman. And therefore, it relies on that notion in terms of how people are treated under the law. Yeah, so for example, I'm going to talk about a case in 1873, Bradwell versus Illinois. Now, Bradwell was a woman who passed the Illinois bar exam, but the Illinois Supreme Court wouldn't let her practice law. She appeals this decision to the Supreme Court, which denies her claim under the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is, of course, where most civil rights legislation originates. The 14th Amendment has generated more litigation than any other amendment because it provides for the equal protection of the laws. So she used that and it didn't work for her. And the court used that separate spheres ideology, so the idea that there is an inherent difference between men and women, The court uses that idea, the separate spheres ideology, in order to justify their decision to say, no, you can't actually practice law because you're a woman and you belong in the home. So, this is why the fairness doctrine can be dangerous and part of the critique. Now, citizenship historically has been constructed differently for men and for women. So, I already briefly mentioned coverture and how coverture comes from England. Well, in addition to women not being able to vote, to own property, and all these other things, there was no such thing as a marital rape under this idea of coverture because husband and wife were considered one person. So, if you're considered one person, a husband can't legally rape his wife because they are one entity under the law. It's not until 1978 that the state of New York outlaws marital rape. And historically, to change gears here, women would lose their citizenship when they married an alien. And in 1907, Congress actually passes a law that says women will lose their citizenship if they marry an alien, even if they're living in the United States. And the law further goes on to say that a woman has to adopt the nationality of her husband. However, the converse isn't true. Men who would marry an alien don't have to adopt the nationality of their wife. Now, in 1915, in a court case called McKenzie versus Hare, the Supreme Court upholds this law. And it's not until 1922 that the Cable Act, passed by Congress, finally changes this. Now, feminism is often controversial because it challenges many of these gendered sex roles that we have in society. It challenges patriarchy. Sometimes it's challenging capitalism. And this word was initially coined in the 1910s to talk about women's goals other than suffrage. And feminism has often been co opted as a negative term, but people who often use feminism as a negative term don't realize that there are multiple types of feminism. So that's what I'm going to talk about next, are the plural feminisms. And this isn't an all inclusive list to kind of give you a heads up. There are many other forms of feminism as well, but this kind of gives you a broad overview of different types of feminism. So, liberal feminism. So, again, I don't mean liberal versus conservative in terms of ideology. I'm talking about this emphasis on individuality. So, liberal feminism emphasizes rationality and individuality over the common good. It works within existing political structures to get rid of sexual discrimination. So, it's adopting that equality based approach to for women to achieve equality in society. So the idea is that you reform current legal and political systems to allow for equal opportunity to resources. Now, the critiques, there are multiple critiques of liberal feminism. So it tends to focus only on the public sphere and it doesn't address unpaid labor in the home, domestic violence, marital rape, and other practices. So personal issues aren't addressed because they are part of the private sphere. It's often been co-opted, by the male establishment, and it tends to focus on Western individual values. And of course, embedded within this, all right, are a lot of racist, classist, and heterosexist, notions of feminism as well. Now, radical feminism. There are lots of subgroups of radical feminism. So when I say radical feminism, I'm not talking about one thing. But kind of overarching among radical feminists are that the sex gender system is the problem. So this is the source of women's oppression. And they tend to want total revolution. So, for example, historically, the Red Stockings. So they argue that sexism needs to be dealt with first. And there are two primary approaches to eliminating sexism. So one is to promote androgyny by eliminating male female distinctions, and the other is to embrace female characteristics as superior. And again, oftentimes when people talk about feminism and they're trying to paint it in a negative light, they refer specifically to this. So, celebrating community, sharing, emotion, nature, peace, over concepts like hierarchy, power, war, and domination. So they're arguing women shouldn't try to be like men. They're arguing, that's what liberal feminists, want. They want basically women to be like men. So they're like, no, women shouldn't be like men. This is sometimes associated with lesbian separatist movements. But one of the primary critiques of this is that it's essentialist. Again, that there is some essentialist notion of men and women, and then it goes, again, some forms of it go one step further and argue that those female characteristics are superior. So, because of that, it's also very polarizing. And it, of course, has been critiqued as destroying the family. Now, Marxist socialist feminism argues that capitalism is the root of women's oppression more than sexism. So, women are exploited in capitalism. They tend to get the lowest pay, menial jobs, and of course, they don't get any pay at home. So, they are pushing for policies that redistribute wealth. So, for example, pay for housework. But the primary critique of Marxist socialist feminism is that women are still in low status, low paying occupations in Marxist socialist regimes, and they still have the primary responsibility for childcare and for the home. So, again, the critique is that, yeah, none of this really, matters because in these sorts of economic systems, we still see women facing the same exact problem. Now, global feminism focuses on the ways in which various forms of oppression are interconnected. It focuses on third world women who argue that economic and political oppression are just as bad as sexual oppression, and that criticizes first world women for being blind to their own oppression. So they're arguing that Western women have agendas that are too narrow, particularly liberal feminists, and that cultural differences are also very complex. So they argue that Western women are too critical of practices like dowry and bride price, for example. Now, Black feminism is also sometimes called multicultural feminism. And Black feminists are the most vocal critics of mainstream liberal feminism because, of course, the underlying racist assumptions that are embedded in liberal feminism. So, sexism can't be separated from racism or classism or any other ism. You have multiple oppressions in society. So, that's kind of the underlying philosophy of Black feminism. So, and also, if any of you have a chance, I recommend that you read Patricia Hill Collins. She has kind of the seminal book on Black feminism, which is fabulous. So, the primary critiques that Black feminists level are actually leveled among themselves against each other. So, Black women also argue that, or again, some of Black feminists have argued that Black women have not confronted sexism as it has happened specifically in the Black community. So, for example, the Clarence Thomas hearing. So, some of you may be old enough like me to remember this, some of you may not. But when there were hearings for Clarence Thomas's confirmation to the Supreme Court, it became very controversial because Anita Hill accused him of sexual harassment. The next thing we knew, we were talking about whether or not he'd put pubic hair on Coke cans. I mean, I know these Supreme Court hearings are always quite entertaining, aren't they? In some very, very sad ways. So, again, part of the critique in Black feminism is that, that too many Black feminists defended the actions of Clarence Thomas. So instead of, calling out the sexist behavior in the Black community. So again, it tends to be within. Now, ecofeminism is a variant of ecological ethics and it emphasizes connectedness and argues that patriarchy damages nature as well as women. And they argue that the environment is a feminist issue. So again, the critique, which you've heard me say before, is that it is essentialist in nature. And it's essentialist to equate women with nature specifically. Now, gender feminism is also sometimes called difference feminism. And the argument here is that women's oppression is due to biology, psychology, and culture. And they believe that the traits associated with femininity are superior to masculine traits. So, for example, Carol Gilligan writes in a different voice about an ethic of care versus an ethic of justice to make decisions. So, if you had me for PPA 500, you may have heard me talk about this before. But she has, again, a very essentialist notion. And this type of feminism also celebrates motherhood and maternalism. But again, part of the critique of gender feminism is that it's essentialist in nature, that it reinforces gender stereotypes, and that by celebrating things like motherhood, you are thereby leaving out all of the women in society who are not mothers. And lastly, I want to talk about intersectionality. So this is coming also out of critical race theory. This term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar. And I'm not going to put it as a type of feminism, but of course it overlaps. So intersectionality is the idea that people are facing intersecting forms of oppression. So power systems like sexism, racism, classism don't exist in isolation. Basically, people have overlapping multiple social identities that can't be separated out. So therefore, we have to, any way we define these things is basically denying some part of somebody's identity. So, to give you an example of this, so at the American Political Science Association meetings, my one of my advisors on my dissertation committee was a woman who was Latino, and she was involved in both the Latino caucus and the women's caucus. And for some reason, I don't know why, I don't think it was a grand conspiracy, but it was obviously an example of this being of intersectionality being overlooked. So the Latino caucus meeting and the women's caucus meetings would always be held at exactly the same time. And so my advisor would always joke, well, all right, I've got to pick today whether or not I'm going to be Latino or women. Which meeting am I going to go to? So, that kind of helps to illustrate, I think, the idea of intersectionality is that you often wind up having to choose in some way, when of course you can't choose because you're often all of these things that are based on your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your class, and you can't separate those out neatly. Now, first, getting more to the Women in Public Service book as I transition here. First, let's address the guiding principles or the underlying assumptions of the book. And so some of this will be a slight repeat, but I wanted to kind of lay things out more generally, some of these concepts first, and then get into the specifics of the book. So the first assumption is that men and women are equal, not the same, but that they should be equal under the law. And again, the difference between sex and gender is that sex refers to biology and gender refers to the social construction of sex, how we interpret those sex based characteristics and how we value them, because the value we place on those characteristics is not neutral either. So the authors reject biological determinism. And I'll also just go ahead and tell you, I do too. I reject essentialist notions as well. That's the personal decision that I have come to after reading the feminist literature is that I also reject that biological determinism because, again, how we interpret these sex based characteristics is often, what gives someone power or gives someone, lack of power or lack of credibility in certain situations. And of course, socialization affects biology too. And ultimately, men and women are more alike than different, just like people of different races and ethnicities are more alike than they are different. But in our society, we tend to focus on those differences instead of focusing on the vast similarities that we have. So just because there are a few biological differences between men and women doesn't mean that they can't be treated equally under the law. They don't have to be the same to be treated equally under the law. Now, gender parity means that you have 50% representation. Now, the claim that time will solve all representation, um, is a faulty claim, according to the authors. It can help with some of these problems, but not all of these problems. And I think we see this partly with the pipeline to political office. We'll talk about political office in a later chapter, but one of the arguments is that it's a pipeline problem. And some of these things, if they were just a pipeline problem, they would have been solved by this point, and they haven't been. Now, the next assumption that the authors are making is that leadership has historically been associated with stereotypical masculine traits, but that is starting to change. So you can see this, for example, in the last presidential election. I mean, I can guarantee you, regardless of how you feel about Hillary, part of the reason she got on some of the committees that she did when she was in Congress is because she was wanting to be seen as tough on particular issues. She wasn't she wasn't going to be on any committees that might deal with children and families and women's issues because she wanted to be perceived as tough. Because I think we can all probably agree that she was planning on running for president. So she wanted to appeal, to those stereotypical masculine traits. And I think that she was targeting that. And a lot of women in public office, that's what they're doing. They're setting themselves up for that. And the reason is because leadership has historically been defined with what we consider stereotypical masculine traits. Now, that is starting to change. So, interestingly, we see a lot of businesses in the private sector, for example, adopting more collaborative and participative leadership styles that we consider to be stereotypically more feminine. So, that is starting to change somewhat, but I think we still see at all of our top layers of government these masculine traits being associated with leadership. Now, there's not a strict separation between public and private spheres anymore, and there never really has been. But for women to advance in organizations, they also need to have changes in their roles at home too. Because as long as you're overburdened at home, you're never going to be able to advance in the public sphere, is another one of their underlying assumptions. So let's discuss why representation matters. So first, let's address it specifically in the context of the civil service. So one reason it matters is basic, it's fairness. So women and minorities deserve the same political rights, including access to public service jobs. Women make up half the population, yet they do not make half of the jobs. And minoritized groups are not represented in comparison to their ratio in the general population either. And it helps you. Another reason why representation matters is because it helps you as an organization get all perspectives. So it can help you serve as citizens or customers if you're a private business better by getting multiple perspectives. So when you have a lack of representation, it often leads to a lack of trust. So, for example, I'm sure we're all familiar with I say recent, it's actually been over 5 years now, but Ferguson. So I'm sure that you'll remember there was not trust there between the citizens in Ferguson, which is in North County, suburb of St. Louis, and between the government there. And again, there was not adequate representation of African Americans in the city government. So when you don't have this lack of representation, and then you have other mitigating factors, as you did in the Michael Brown case, then you can have disastrous consequences, obviously, as was the case with Ferguson. So let's talk about what diversity is. Now, this is respecting individuals for their different characteristics. This can be color, this can be race, this can be ethnicity, gender, age, religion, sexual orientation, or way of thinking. Conflict is generally minimal in more homogeneous environments, but homogeneous environments are problematic at two levels. So, first, based on an equity argument, it's unjust to exclude any segment of society because they are different. And then the consumerist argument against homogeneous environments is that people of a single sex or race have a limited ability to understand and solve the problems of a complex citizenry. So diverse organizations can therefore better serve their clients. There are also equity-based arguments for diversity that are tied to the notion of popular sovereignty, which is the idea that people give their consent to be governed. That's kind of the whole basic premise of the United States government. Or, another way to think of it is that citizens are the source of political power because power comes from the will of the people. So therefore, all right, you need to have that representation. Now, I want you to reflect back for a moment to the PA dichotomy, the public administration dichotomy that Wilson wrote about in 1887. So, to refresh your memory very quickly, Wilson advocated for a separation of politics and administration. And he he was arguing that you could separate these two things. However, many scholars came along afterwards and said you can't really separate politics from administration. People can exercise power through elections, of course, but the PA dichotomy has been questioned because administrators often do exercise discretion in policy making, which again kind of nullifies that notion that you can separate politics and administration. So, for example, they have input in legislation, which could involve participation in hearings. It could involve them actually writing legislation, although this is more rare. But, for example, the Patriot Act was written almost entirely by the Department of Justice. Now, political scientists often refer to this as the iron triangle. This is when you have an interest group, an elected official on a committee, and bureaucrats or public administrators. So they make up basically the 3 points on a triangle. Now, this idea is given way to issue networks, which is basically an opening up of the triangle to more interests, to multiple interests. So you don't have just 3 points on a triangle, you have multiple interests. Now, rulemaking is done at the federal level and at the state and the local to varying degrees, and it also influences policy. Policy implementation is the idea that policy is made during implementation. So some of you may be familiar with Lipsky's street level bureaucracy, but in this book, to give you kind of a really brief version of this, Lipsky argues that street level bureaucrats, like police officers, like teachers, basically they are making policy because of the discretion that they have. So if you are a street level bureaucrat who is on the front lines in some way, like a teacher or a police officer, you are able to make policy because of the discretion you have to interpret policy. So, why is this important in regards to that notion of popular sovereignty I mentioned? We need to have a representative bureaucracy as well as democracy because the bureaucracy wields a great deal of power. It's not a substitute for representative democracy, but you need to have not only a representative democracy in terms of elected officials, but you need to have that representative bureaucracy because they do have a lot of power in policymaking and decision making. Now, there are two primary arguments for representation of women and historically disadvantaged groups in the labor force. So, one rests on diversity, which of course is necessary for popular sovereignty. You must have, again, the consent of the governed. Traditional PA theory assumed that the bureaucracy was neutral and objective and they merely implemented the law, but it wasn't the case. Now, the Minnowbrook Conference, which if you had me for PPA 500, you've probably heard a little bit about the Minnowbrook Conference. If not, we'll talk about this in the new public administration a little more with the social equity readings, kind of mid-semester with Frederickson. So the new public administration, one of the driving factors of this movement and of Frederickson's writing, one of the driving factors of Frederickson's writing was the civil rights movement. This was the context in which he was writing. Diversity also lends legitimacy to an organization as well. Now, equality is the second reason women and minorities should be represented in the labor force. It all boils down to basic fairness. Now, the consumerist argument for representative democracy helps organizations to better serve their customers or their citizens. Private businesses were historically opposed to government interventions, but they've embraced it more and more because it's good for business. Now, identity diversity is based on demographics, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds, as well as training and experience, while functional diversity often refers to how people solve problems. They can be linked, though. Population demographics are changing, and the workforce needs to change with that. So the organization needs to mirror the representation of certain groups in the population. Now, these aren't the most recent 2017 numbers, but they're roughly the same, even though they are a little bit outdated. So, African Americans comprise 12% of the population in the United States, Asians comprise 8%, Hispanics comprise 15%, and women make up 51% of the population. And there are different types of representation. There's passive representation and active representation. Passive representation is just for appearances. This can lead to stereotyping and speaking for your group. So, this is when women basically have to speak for all women, or an African American has to speak for all African Americans. What you want to get to is active representation. So, this is making the representation meaningful and avoiding tokenism that you often wind up with under passive representation. Occupational segregation that's due to stereotypes about women and men permeate organizational culture as well as larger society in general. Women are relegated to lower paying jobs, not just because they choose those or because they choose them, period. And they're denied supervisory position because those gender stereotypes not only influence how women are seen at home, society in general, but specifically what they're capable of in the workplace. Now, I've already discussed patriarchy and coverture, so I'm not going to go over that again. But I'd like to move on to work life conflict and why it affects women more than men. Women still tend to bear more responsibility at home due to societal norms and expectations. This is also affected by class. Working class employees have less flexibility at work than upper and middle class employees do. Now, gender roles are these attitudes and behaviors that are socially acceptable. They do vary by culture and they vary by historic period. They're not necessarily static, um, but they change over time. But oftentimes, we still see things rooted in the public or private sphere when it comes to gender. So we tend to punish those who act outside of those roles. So if men act outside those roles or women, we punish them. So men who cry, for example, are often treated very negatively in our culture and are made fun of or maybe picked on or bullied. And women who are assertive, are considered to be bossy or bitchy. But either sex can adopt these behaviors because they're not biologically determined. This is part of our socialization process, and it has implications in the workforce when men aren't acting according to certain gender stereotypes or women aren't. Now, I'd like you to take a look at the implicit bias tests that the book refers to on page 23. I think those are interesting, if you have time to take one of those. And then last, let's talk about institutional discrimination. Institutional discrimination is generally unconscious and unintentional. So, prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, discrimination was just out and out. Hey, if you're a woman, we don't want you for this job. Or hey, if you're in this minority group, we don't want you for this job. And it was just fine and dandy, all right, to say that because it was perfectly legal. Now, even though the laws are equal and have been equal for quite a while since 1964, theoretically, this discrimination should be gone, right? Well, no, it's not gone because institutional discrimination still persists because it's not intentional. So you're not overtly trying to keep a particular group out, but it is built into the system because the rules were made for different groups. So they don't apply to all of the other groups. So, for example, having meetings at 3 o'clock in the afternoon often, is biased against women because women are often the ones who are taking primary responsibility for childcare and have to pick up children after school. Now, this isn't something that has been necessarily planned as a grand scheme to make things difficult for women. However, this is an example of how institutional discrimination can be perpetuated in an organization.